Hi there, and welcome to this week's episode of Truffle Talks. I'm James Stephen, the editor of Truffle Report, and Truffle Talks is our new interview series where we're sitting down with the movers and shakers defining psychedelic business, policy reform, science, and culture. Joining us today is Professor Erika Dyck, an historian and Canada Research Chair at the University of Saskatchewan's College of Arts and Sciences. Erika specializes in the history of health and medicine, psychiatry, and most importantly, for my purposes, psychedelics. She has also been collaborating with author Hugh Goldring and illustrator Nicole Burton on Wonder Drug, LSD in the Land of Living Skies, from Between the Lines books, a newly published graphic novel detailing what I'm going to call the surprisingly down-home Canadian prairie origins of psychedelic research here in Canada. Erika, it's a pleasure to have you here. Why don't we start with a bit more about yourself and what got you interested in these areas of research?
Thanks, James. It's wonderful to be here. I started doing this research about 20 years ago. I was a PhD student. I'm from Saskatchewan, but I was doing my PhD at McMaster University in Ontario. So it was a bit of a surprise and maybe a little bit of embarrassment for me to realize after trolling through papers and archives and libraries in Ontario that I had to return to Saskatchewan, where I think the real action was in terms of this story about psychedelics. And the story has really changed a lot over the past 20 years. And so it's really quite interesting now to reflect back on some of that earlier research and to continue doing research in this area as the conversation really changes and the stories really heat up.
Okay, so why don't we just start, way back in time with you telling our audience a bit more about the story of, Humphrey Osmond and Weyburn and a few of the original psychedelic research anecdotes from here in Canada.
Yeah, so the story about psychedelics in Canada, I think, is really fascinating because it touches upon so many different aspects of Canadian history. And of course, psychedelics are not only part of Canadian history, but it's not a coincidence or an accident that psychedelics really took root in the Prairie Province of Saskatchewan. In 1944, of course, Tommy Douglas was elected as, the first so-called socialist premier in Canada, in North America for that matter. And he did so on a campaign to deeply transform healthcare. And we can argue as to whether or not he accomplished those deeds. But one of the ways that he set about doing healthcare reforms was to invite different kinds of researchers who were dedicated to sort of thinking outside the box or thinking about approaches that might not fit into a conventional or standard approach. One of the people he invited in 1951 was Humphrey Osmond. He became the superintendent of a major mental hospital. And he's one of the main figures in the story, both in Wonder Drug, but also in the history of psychedelics, because he coins the word psychedelic. And here he was perched in this, sort of lonely place, certainly according to his wife and children, a lonely place in the windswept prairies of Saskatchewan. And he had come and was starting to do research with mescaline and LSD. And by 1956, he and his friend Aldous Huxley seized upon this word psychedelic to capture the sort of enthusiasm and passion that led to the kind of research that they were doing using psychedelics in the 50s.
Mm-hmm. And I think Aldous Huxley originally called it something else, didn't he?
He did. He initially called it phanerothym. Mm-hmm. And you see this word sort of picked up still. The Shulgins play upon phanerothym in some of their own work. Mm-hmm. But he described phanerothym, what did he say? To make this mundane world sublime, just half a gram of phanerothym. Mm-hmm. And Humphrey Osmond responded to him. Again, these were in letters and correspondence in 1956, where he said, "To plumb the depths or soar angelic, you'll need a pinch of psychedelic."
a bit of an early research bromance going on there.
Oh, perhaps. total bromance.
Okay, and in your mind, why is this story important today?
Well, I think that psychedelics are getting a bit of a retrial or a rebirth or a renaissance. There's different words associated with this depending on which newsfeed you follow. But, I think there's an enthusiasm for investing in psychedelics again. And it cuts across a variety of points, I think. One is an interest in trying to find something that tackles persistent and major mental disorders, which we haven't seen a lot of improvement in over the past 75 years, despite huge investments and a huge turn to psychopharmacological solutions. And psychedelics don't operate like a typical pharmaceutical. They're supposed to be a sort of one-time or rare time intense breakthrough therapy that allows people to see themselves differently, to gain perspective, often to do in combination with things like psychotherapy. Or if we go back before the 1950s and even since the 1950s, there's also a lot of history of ceremonial uses of psychedelics or plant medicines in indigenous ceremonies, often with a kind of ritualistic component associated with it. And we start to think about using treatments or seeking healing encounters outside of a strictly sort of doctor-patient relationship or doctor-pharmacist relationship, it opens up a whole variety of possibilities. And I think that's part of the enthusiasm that attracted researchers in the past. And I think that same spirit of thinking outside the box or thinking outside of the conventional mainstream approaches is part of what's dazzling researchers again today and getting a lot of followers. And not just that, but the results have been quite promising. And I'm sure your listeners are familiar with some of the results in the past 5 to 7 years.
I would just say that a lot of that ritualistic sort of softer setting, let's call it, has now made its way back into the laboratory. I know Osmond discovered during the course of his original research that the sort of hard white clinical hospital rooms did not get the same results as a more gentler surroundings, psychiatrist couch, soft lights, things like that. And we have already learned from these lessons and incorporated music, visuals, meditative practices into these substances and into the at this point pretty limited but still evolving sphere of psychotherapy that's attached to them.
Absolutely. I think, early researchers didn't necessarily have the words to describe it. We now call it set and setting, and that was, coined also in this earlier period. But the idea that you would have empathetic observers, so people who had direct experience with psychedelic drugs or, prior to the word, hallucinogenic drugs, but also having things like music or photos or flowers, things that initially they thought might help to distract people from the kind of anxiety that they had about like, what's going to happen to me? What am I going to see? Am I going to hallucinate? But over a short period of time, they realized that those distracting features were actually really helpful for optimizing results as well, that they allowed people to concentrate on things like photographs or the folds in a flower petal that might actually help to produce insights and help people to sort of focus their attention in different ways. And they became really instrumental in helping to maximize or optimize those therapeutic benefits.
All right, so stepping back for a second, as an historian, what differentiates the interest in psychedelic medicine back then from now? I remember another term that I came across in researching Osmond and Weyburn was not psychedelic or phenerethon, but psychotomometic. And the thought was that these substances mimicked insanity. And it wasn't that they would necessarily cure anything, it's just that they would give a better understanding of the processes and treatments for something like, say, schizophrenia or psychosis, because they could put someone in that frame of mind.
Yeah, and I think my job as a historian is often to sort of contextualize these bigger questions, and so I'll say a couple of points of contextualization. One is that by mid 20th century, most places in the Western world were still treating major mental disorders by placing people in custodial facilities. So asylums, big hospitals, these are segregated spaces where people are sent, and many people live the rest of their lives once they were admitted into these facilities. In those places, I think the sort of demographic picture of mental illness looked rather different than we might imagine today. So a lot of psychotic disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression with psychosis, and these psychotic symptoms really captured the attention of psychiatrists who were working in these places, wondering like, how do we communicate with these people? As talk therapies were continuing to move into this professional environment, it was very difficult to have a talking psychotherapy session with someone who is hallucinating or who's hearing voices. And one of the things that Osmond wanted to do, and he's not alone in this, is to try to understand from a patient perspective what was happening. psychoanalysts go through their own psychoanalytical training, as a way of preparing for being a good analysand, and taking that sort of philosophy, I think, and combining that with pharmaceuticals. The idea that one would take drugs to try to understand their patients was not completely bizarre, although applying it in this particular way, again, sort of moved outside of the box or took some of the traditional methods and applied it in a different way.
Well, I'd also just like to interject and say that something we've learned from studying the history of LSD as well is that it was totally normal for chemists and therapists to just down a little bit of their own concoctions back then to test them. That Hoffman, tested LSD on himself just alone in his lab, sort of, well, down the hatch, before administering it to anyone else, was really pretty standard practice for the time in the 1940s.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. The ethics have really changed from really trying to distance the, researcher or observer from the subject itself, and the subject in this case being a drug. And at that time, I think it was much more commonplace to have a personal experience and then to be able to describe it in their own words and use that to sort of give them different authority. Over time, with randomized controlled trials, we really removed that feature of the experimental context.
I would say we're getting back to it to a certain degree, though, not necessarily for the experimental context, but for the clinical context. We're seeing psychedelic therapy organizations like Therasil and Atma Journey centers moving to train their clinicians and nurses and therapeutic administrators with psilocybin, so that they know, what their terminal patients are going through. It's maybe the assumption going on there is that it's not reasonable to expect someone to guide a patient through this without having some idea of the experience themselves, even though each individual experience is going to be unique to a certain
Absolutely.
degree.
And I think that's part of the sort of psychedelic ethos or psychedelic ethic, if you will, that because these are so idiosyncratic, I've read through over 1,000 now reports from people who were taking these for the first time and in a therapeutic context. They didn't have, other people's guides to go by. So these are quite sort of naive reports. And it's very difficult to sort of categorize them in any confident way. How many people saw snakes, how many people saw a god or a godlike figure, you can kind of roughly estimate, but even once you get beyond these really broad strokes, the experiences are so individualized that it's difficult to sort of put that into it through a statistical scaling up. And so I think that idea of having therapists or guides have their own experience just to appreciate the sort of edges or the scope of possibility is really important. And I know both Therasil and Atma are really keen to sort of resurrect some of these historical principles that were very much ethical at the time. And it's not that they were just wrong-headed about their ethics, but I think as it aligns with psychedelics, we see a different set of arrangements in place. And I think not just in the legal context in the 1950s and early 60s, but learning from some of the underground therapists and Indigenous elders who've continued to sort of protect these as sacred medicines or as, protected encounters, those sort of principles are still at play. So it's partly about revisiting the ethical territory, I think.
And for what it's worth, in my opinion, I think there's no good reason you can't have that, removed, step back scientific research where you are not consuming the drug, and the therapeutic experience where you have consumed the drug to administer it to patients. I don't think it has to be one or the other. It should probably be both, in fact.
Yeah. I think if there's an assumption that, these drugs are going to cause some kind of ill effects or harmful effects, and, there's already a kind of stigma built into this enterprise in some respects. And I think that's partly what the psychedelic renaissance is trying to challenge, is trying to peel back those layers of historical stigma and reputation that have challenged this research in the past.
Okay, so that's a kind of a perfect segue into my next point. What are some of the successes and the flaws in the research done by Osmond and the original team at Weyburn in Saskatchewan, and how can we learn from them?
Yeah, I think this idea of really investing in imagining a kind of empathetic interaction or empathetic relationship was a real win. It's difficult to sort of nail that down or to codify that into practice or protocols. But I think imagining creating an empathetic relationship with the psychotherapist in this case, or the psychiatrist, or the social worker, sometimes therapist. That's really important. And it's something that needs to be carried forward. And it sometimes doesn't align neatly with some of the protocols we have in place today. So that's one thing. And I do see that being picked up, like you've already mentioned, some of the organizations here in Canada. That's exciting. I think, there's a lot of course, looking at the 1950s, there's some updating we could do with language and like basic things like sexism and racism in the workplace. And rather than just to pick on those as kind of cliched examples, I think there were missed opportunities to go a little deeper into some of the ways in which relationships were being built. So although it's a really good thing to see, the way that psychedelics were allowing particular kinds of relationships to develop, others were kept out. And I think in some respects, those boiled down to 1950s concepts of, what women brought to the table, for example, or how Indigenous ceremonial features might actually be incorporated into a scientific setting. And it wasn't to say that these guys, they were mostly guys, were ignorant of those principles, but I think we could do more with that. And I think, in the 21st century, there's a different professional atmosphere when it comes to thinking about bringing in different ways of understanding experience, different ways of articulating trauma or pain. Instead of trying to really get that down to a standard version, I think psychedelics open up the possibility of imagining a diversity of experiences that could be harnessed to really help us to think differently.
I agree with you, but I would also say that they did not dismiss any, they being Osmond et al., did not dismiss everything outside of the clinical realm out of hand. I know Aldous Huxley in particular, how should I put this, loved his Orientalism. And a lot of that bled through. So I would say that they were maybe kind of cherry picking the cultures and traditions that they felt had value to the experience and sort of sweeping the others aside.
Yeah, and I want to say that I don't think that these guys, Huxley, Osmond, or Abe Hoffer, Duncan Blewett, other Canadian figures, necessarily ignored these features. In fact, I think that they tried to incorporate them to perhaps a greater degree than we've seen, certainly in the sort of typical story of antidepressant medications. They participated in Native American church rituals. They went to and worked closely with some incredible women who were not sort of within the frame of conventional psychiatry. These were women who worked as parapsychologists or psychics, or worked in the Soviet Union, for example, operating with a whole variety of different theories around deprivation. So I think they were quite expansive thinkers. I think those elements have not been sufficiently integrated into the sort of psychedelic enterprise going forward. Two things on that. I think the image of psychedelic research, from sort of historically looking at it, it tends to look like an elitist white guy's story.
Male, pale, and stale was the phrase I heard thrown around once.
Sure. I mean, and I think, I think that's a little bit unfair in some respects, because I think they were attempting to draw in these other figures, but some of those figures don't get named. They don't get integrated, and they don't really become part of the story. So we as historians can do a better job of highlighting a more diverse legacy. But I think going forward, this is part of one of those reputations that needs to be challenged, right? That psychedelics are not just for those who can afford them or the pale, male, and stale, but that there is actually a much wider set of diverse applications that have historical links as well. So I think this is a big challenge for psychedelics to move past that reputation as both, in terms of the drug regulation piece, where these are dangerous drugs apparently, but also the idea that these are drugs with a kind of heritage that is pale, male, and stale. I'll just keep using that now.
Okay. Yeah, no charge. Feel free.
Yeah, thanks.
I guess that leads me to ask, as these become more available, to me, the history of psychedelic research is very much one of unintended consequences, let's call them. Certainly, these were substances that I don't think anyone was fighting to. The potential was obvious from the start at Weyburn. There were obviously people within the mental health care system at the time that didn't want this to move forward, the same as now. But the research, the research did gain some considerable traction. There were papers, there were results, and then, as happens with most substances, they escaped from the lab and became party drugs, counterculture things, that developed a life of their own.
Mm.
And how do we learn from that? Do we see that happening again? Uh, there, because we're not just talking with the current interest in psychedelics. We're not just talking about the same substances again. A lot of the interest on the pharmaceutical and corporate and drug development side is new compounds with clinical applications. Are we in danger of repeating history and someone catapulting those over the wall towards the eager masses for recreational purposes?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some respects, we're always at risk of repeating history. And, it's a bit of a cliche too. But yeah, it's a good question, and one that I've struggled to sort of get clear thoughts on, and I will do that again today. I think there's always a risk of drugs being taken outside of their intended consequence, of their intended uses, and that is not unique to psychedelics. Psychedelics have a particular reputation and an association with, these larger than life figures who came to embody that recklessness and that reckless behavior and dangerous behavior. You can think of Charles Manson and how he perhaps, stimulated a psychedelic cult to engage in murderous activities. We can look at Tim Leary, who multiple times was sent to prison for his flamboyant recommendations of drug use, but also his own behavior at the border.
I mean, I think of Ken Kesey too in the acid tests, where it was supposed to be like a prank. I think they were calling themselves the Merry Pranksters, where they just dosed everyone who came to their parties. And it's easy to laugh at with some distance, but up close, like, no, that's actually a fairly violent thing to do to someone, is to feed them a bunch of LSD without their consent.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of recklessness that was associated with this, with an acid revolution, if you will, is something that, of course, we're at risk of, people taking things in a reckless or careless way. But I think our attitudes, our sort of cultural understanding or literacy, drug literacy, has also changed. So if we were to think back to, we could go back to the Summer of Love, we could go to 1967, we could think about those acid tests that were, promoted by the Merry Pranksters, and with acid manufactured and distributed in totally black market ways. And, if we think about the parallels, what kinds of drugs were available at the drugstore at that time, we've ratcheted up our use of pharmaceuticals in such a tremendous way over the past 50 to 75 years that I think even kids these days, I've got young children, our understanding of chemicals in our environment has changed. Our sort of fluency with that has changed. And I think with that, we've also introduced a deeper set of expectations around harm reduction. We expect to learn more about these things. And I think there's an opportunity, as psychedelics come back into the light, to start thinking about, how do we just say no, KNOW? How do we build some information around what these drugs represent, how to take them safely, the same way we talk to our kids about taking alcohol, or especially now, cannabis. We do have drugs that, when taken, I don't want my 8-year-old, to have some edibles. I think that would be dangerous, and I would be concerned about that. But there are ways that we manage to create messaging and literacy around the safe use of everything from aspirin to LSD. And I think we're ready for that. I think our sort of cultural relationship with drugs and chemicals in our environment has changed such that I think we can develop those conversations, and we can have those conversations.
I agree with you about particular, like, I like what you say, the proliferation of pharmaceutical substances. I've seen it. We've all seen it. I would argue that it has not exactly made us healthier either. You could,
No.
I would make a pretty strong argument that the more we're exposed to these, the worse our health has gotten. But I would also offer that in that 50s and 60s time period, they were not exactly short of just over-the-counter sedatives and amphetamines and things you could buy without any real regulation, and just putting amphetamines in particular were a bit of a wonder drug,
Mhm.
touted as a bit of a wonder drug during the 50s, and were just prescribed for almost everything. um, but I do agree with you that in the end, literacy and new approaches and harm reduction are kind of the order of the day for all of it. And that's interesting because just as we've been talking, I've seen a notification pop up from one of my staff saying that the city of Toronto, the police, the chief medical officer of health are now formally requesting the feds allow uh, possession of small amounts of illegal drugs here in Toronto.
Hmm.
And that is a pretty major step forward. And it's something, we've already seen in Vancouver is going forward, something that's certainly happened here. It's probably going to be another request for Section 56 exemption for the entire city type of thing. But at the very least, it's a lot of people in important positions and, in law enforcement and government admitting that maybe the way we've been doing this isn't quite working out for us.
I think one of these historical, it's lovely to be able to look back and see this, but I think, beginning in the 1950s and certainly by the 1970s, there were kind of firm lines drawn between the drugs that were regulated and considered sort of acceptable, even with certain caveats, like you shouldn't take this while pregnant or while driving or whatever it might be.
I
And
mean,
those that were
one of my favorites in those regard, my grandmother, when she was pregnant in 1950 with my uncle, was told to take up smoking to ease the pregnancy tension. So,
right. Yeah. I mean, our understanding of the appropriate use of a variety of psychoactive compounds, not just psychopharmaceuticals,
mhm.
has changed a bit over time. But psychopharmacologist David Healy, he's written a number of books and he's quite critical of big pharma. But one of the things he argues is that the 1950s were really a paradigm shift in how we begin to think about psychopharmaceuticals and pharmaceuticals more broadly, that more amphetamines, antidepressants, antihistamines, anti-anxiety medications were introduced at that time than ever before in human history. And that most of the ones that we have available to us even today still have their antecedents in that period. So there really was a dramatic shift, I think, in what was available on the marketplace. And we were still sort of waiting for consumers, in some respects, to determine the risks. Thalidomide was like, that was not tested appropriately, and it gets moved into another category, but it was on the market for, in 11 months in Canada. There were other drugs that also started to, they go out into the market, and that's where you experience those diverse users. So things aren't all held carefully through the trials. And I think the same thing is and will happen with psychedelics. We know that diverse users have used psychedelics in the past, perhaps not legally, perhaps not in a formal trial, but those kinds of experiences are going to filter back in as we try to rebalance the scales here and take the war on drugs off the agenda and begin to think about which drugs have been regulated for economic benefits that maybe don't have health benefits at all. We've seen this happen with tobacco, and which kinds of drugs might actually fit into another category, and maybe psychedelics will be in that category. We've seen it happen with cannabis. It moved from medical cannabis now to, differently regulated, decriminalized cannabis in Canada. I think that would have been hard to predict in 1975 or 85, amidst this kind of intense war on drugs. But as that shifts, I think we're going to see a variety of different products. And I hope we don't see anything that goes to like, this one will solve all our problems. I don't think there's any kind of magic bullet solution, but I think having more information and having a harm reduction approach to taking psychoactive substances is probably a good thing for all of us.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Wonder Drug itself. Tell us about how you were approached for that. Tell us about collaborating with the author and illustrator on creating this very interesting graphic novel.
Yeah, so initially the graphic novel I was approached by Hugh and Nicole, and they asked whether I'd be comfortable, setting this up. It was based on my doctoral research that I had done in the early 2000s. And I, of course, was thrilled by this. I was flattered by it, but I wanted to make a few adjustments. There are things that I think differently. And the conversation, as I said, has changed. I wanted it to, acknowledge some of the new work that's been taking place as well. And so we updated a whole last section and sort of made some adjustments throughout to draw in these other perspectives. One example is that throughout the book, you'll see the story of, Humphrey Osmond taking mescaline to Aldous Huxley, and this fun narrative with these colorful characters. But we wanted to acknowledge, for example, things like the role that their wives had played. Their wives don't show up on their published papers rather, or Huxley's novels. But we've since gone through all the correspondence, and it turns out their wives are not only often typing the correspondence, but they're intimately involved in these conversations.
I heard of an interesting expression lately. I forget from who exactly, but it's men of that generation kind of lived in a pat of butter. They just had, their wives were like secretaries, cook everything, and anything they actually did kind of ran through those channels first. And that's it. They're hugely underrated as a result.
There's definitely some of that. And not only were the wives sort of integral to their professional success, but they also had their own networks of interesting people who they brought into the dinner parties where they had these conversations, and sometimes where they took psychedelic drugs. And so we wanted to sort of bring those in, and you can do that in a graphic novel in ways that I failed to do the first time I wrote about this, and I'm trying to make up for that now. But by drawing these pictures of people at dinner parties, we don't know what everybody said, but we can represent that. And Nicole did a beautiful job of representing that by doing images of it. So we hope that this different format will appeal to different audiences, might strike up some different conversations, and get people thinking and talking about the past and the future of psychedelics, but also Canada's role to play in both in anchoring that legacy, but also perhaps in imagining a psychedelic future that has a kind of CanCon.
Well, I think we have a lot of research here. We have a lot of groundbreaking, legal regulatory action going forward in terms of the availability of psychedelic therapy. And we certainly have the private sector interest with something like 100, listed companies now working on this stuff. So I hope the CanCon doesn't get swept aside, because we seem to be here for it.
I'm a historian, as you mentioned. So, my interest is in how we tell these stories and how we sort of wrap up the meaning by narrative, and using narrative to tell these stories. It's, I think, important for harm reduction. It's important for how we communicate to those police officers and whatnot. But I think there's real opportunity here to, memorialize this history and to think about what it means going forward. And I'm excited to be part of that.
All right. Well, I think that is a great place to leave it for today. Thanks, everyone, for tuning into this week's Truffle Talks. Once again, I'm James Stephen, the editor of Truffle Report, and this has been Erika Dyck, professor at the University of Saskatchewan and a collaborator on Wonder Drug, available now from Between the Lines books. You can find us online at truffle.report, or as Truffle Report on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn, and Truffle_report on Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit. See you next week.